Giants and Knicks were in Game 5 when O.J. started that fateful drive. His four-way hazard lights were blinking, and no one knew what the Jews was thinking.
I've been to Reno, Chicago, Fargo, Minnesota, Buffalo, Toronto, Winslow, Sarasota, Wichita, Tulsa, Ottawa, Oklahoma, Tampa, Panama, Mattawa, La Paloma, Bangor, Baltimore, Salvador, Amarillo, Tocopilla, Barranquilla, and Padilla. I'm a killer. I've been everywhere, man. I've been everywhere, man. Crossed the desert bare, man. I breathe the mountain air, man. Of travel I've had my share, man. I've been everywhere.
This is Oversight Live, your advocate for good governance. We're putting the site back in. Oversight. Here's the watcher on the wall, your host, Ben Carpenter.
Good evening, Alaskans. Welcome to Oversight Live this Monday afternoon. It's good to be with you and good to be seen. Good to be back in the saddle here after a few days off. Oversight Live. Well, we are your road to Juneau until one can be built. We know that as Alaskans, we know it's expensive in time and money to get to Juneau. And we're here to help bring Juneau to you with some semblance of sanity and understanding. I spent 6 years in the legislature. I would like to share my experience and my what I learned while I was there with you so that together we can provide better oversight of our government. If you've got questions on tonight's broadcast, you can, and we're broadcasting live on YouTube, X, and Facebook. You can chat in your window there in your chat box, and I'll get that message live, and I'll do my best to answer your question. If I can't answer it, then I'll find an answer for you. If you're watching the broadcast, then you can drop me an email. This is watching the recording. If you're on YouTube or Facebook and watching the recording, you can drop me an email, producer@oversightllive.com, and I'll do my best to answer by email. Or if it's a really good question, I'm going to bring it up on air, and we will answer the question live so that other people can get. I mean, if you've got a question, likely, odds are, other people have the same question. That's just how it works. So anyway, we're going to try to have fun tonight. No sense trying to watch government meetings and not have fun. even as sitting in meetings, sometimes we try to have fun. But anyway, I won't go down there. Let's have fun tonight. So if you've got questions, you have comments, or it's real easy to make fun of politicians, right? So we can at least have fun doing that. All right. What's on the agenda for tonight? Last Friday, or maybe Saturday, the House passed out HB 381, which is the House's version of the gasline tax bill. The Senate already has their Senate Bill 2001 in front of them, the Senate Finance Committee. And now HB 381 is in Senate Finance. Senate Finance Committee met today, and they heard from DNR's, Department of Natural Resources, Dan Stickle. I'm sorry, DOR, Department of Revenues, Dan Stickle. Did I get that wrong? Does he work for DOR or DNR? DOR, Department of Revenue, Dan Stickle, explain exactly what it was that the House passed to the Senate in 381, in HB 381. So we're going to see what that is tonight. And then Glenfarne and AGDC were present to go through the bill and explain what they understand from their perspective. So we're going to watch both of those tonight and get a really good idea of what the Senate maybe is thinking through their questions, and we'll be able to see what's going on. And then the Senate's got to figure out what they want to do, whether they want to pass HB 381 or whether they want to pass their own bill, amend it, whatever. It's got to get passed out of Senate and passed by the Senate and back to the House by the end of the week. So we'll see whether they can get it done. All right. Without further ado, we're going to jump over to Senate Finance earlier today. See if I remember how to do all this. Okay. Here's Dan Stickle beginning of the briefing. Gary, good to see you tonight.
Similar to what we've been presenting.
Okay. We know acronyms.
Slide decks.
There's
Slide
what we're going to cover.
is the overview. So for folks that have seen my presentations before on the gas line bills, this is going to look very familiar. We'll start with a little bit of property tax background, walk through the proposed legislation and the revenue impacts per the fiscal note. We'll talk about implementation costs per our fiscal note. We'll walk through detailed project modeling. And then at the end of this presentation, we have some supplemental slides that were requested by the committee that walk through in detail some of the complexities and nuances of the alternative volumetric tax calculation, both in House Bill 381, as well as a comparison to Senate Bill 2001.
Before we continue, we are joined by three distinguished senators, Senator Kawasaki, Senator Bjorgman, Senator Myers, and Senator Diesel. I forgot to acknowledge them before we started the meeting. Welcome, Mr. Stickle.
All right, so slide 5 is just a little bit of background on the property tax for the folks watching at home or anyone who hasn't been living and breathing this for the last several months. So the state levies an oil and gas property tax on the value of taxable exploration, production, and pipeline transportation property in the state. And this tax is really the essence of what's being addressed through all of these various iterations of the AKLNG bills. So it's a 20 mils tax or 2% of assessed value, and that assessment is done centralized by the State Department of Revenue. We manage the appraisal and assessment process for all oil and gas property in the state. And then any municipal oil and gas property taxes are allowed as a credit against that state tax. And different municipalities in the state have different tax rates. But at the end of the day, it's a 20 mils or 2% tax is what's paid regardless of location in the state for all oil and gas property currently.
You say define distinguished senators. Good evening, Craig. You will not believe it, but well, maybe you will. I don't know. Senators and representatives demand that the chair acknowledge their presence in their committee room. So when the recording's happening, the committee members who are on the committee, or the legislative members who are on the committee, they have their nameplates up there and they're a member of the committee. So the public knows that they're sitting there. And there's a reference. You can go to the website and find out who's on the committee, so you know who's there. Okay. But if you come in as a legislator and you're watching from the gallery like everybody else, like the public would do, if you're coming in and just watching, well, you want the public to know that you're there and participating. So they have to recognize that you're in the room. It is a responsibility of the chair to recognize the rest of the legislators who come in to watch the meeting with you. So yeah, you make people upset, or they'll pout and feel left out if you don't acknowledge their presence. So distinguished is a matter of interpretation or perspective, right? So you use it how you want. Remember, we're talking about the office and not the individual. So keep that in mind. Yeah. You don't buy that? That's the way it should be. We're talking about the office. Come election day, you talk about the person. Right now, we're going to talk about the office. All right, back to the show here.
One item to note is the definition of oil and gas property for our tax does not include an LNG export plant. So under current law, the gas treatment facility and the pipeline of the AKLNG project would be subject to state property tax and local property tax. Under current law, for the LNG plant in Nikiski, that would only be subject to local property tax, not state property tax. And so the current law property tax on that piece of the project would be less than the 20 mils. So
you can understand that statutes that set tax policy decades ago didn't foresee a gas pipeline, right? It just was not part of their thinking when the statutes of the 20 mils and breaking up what is covered under our tax policy at that stage. It wasn't in consideration. So we're literally writing history on what tax structure needs to be the structure for a major gas line like this, okay, that has a facility at both ends and is such a large project. That is what the matter at hand is.
Does the bill before the committee do? Disclaimer on slide 7. Our analysis and interpretations are preliminary, don't represent binding interpretation or tax guidance for on down the road. We are analyzing the committee substitute, the House committee substitute for 381 with the amendment as it passed out of the House last week. And the baseline analysis is based on our baseline AKLNG modeling and our spring 2026 revenue forecast. And later on in the presentation, I have some detailed slides that walk through the assumptions that underline that baseline modeling. So what would this bill do? This bill would create a policy framework for replacing certain state and local property taxes with a temporary tax abatement period followed by an alternative volumetric tax. And there are several DOR specific impacts under this legislation. So the legislation lays out eligibility conditions for receiving that tax framework. The reduction and changes to the current law property tax lays out the new alternative volumetric tax, and then lays out detailed specifications for how that revenue is collected and allocated between the state and various municipalities. We do note on slide 9, for our official fiscal note, we show an indeterminate revenue impact. And that's because there is a significant degree of uncertainty around whether the AKLNG project proceeds, either with or without the tax relief. This bill would provide a tax decrease, which would make the project relatively more attractive for investment. But we show an indeterminate fiscal note given that there's the level of uncertainty under either scenario. In addition to those direct impacts, the project would have indirect impacts on upstream oil and gas revenues, production tax, corporate income tax, oil production, royalty revenue. And that would be both for oil and gas production directly associated with the AKLNG project, as well as potential associated new exploration and development on the North Slope, and potential impacts on Cook Inlet exploration and development as well. Municipalities would be impacted through the reduced property tax, the addition of the alternative volumetric tax revenue, potentially increased property taxes from associated new developments that are not directly subject of this bill. And then always want to note that there are economic benefits and impacts to both the state and municipalities that go far beyond the direct revenue.
Thanks for throwing that in there.
So slide 10 lays out the eligibility conditions. So under House Bill 381, the property tax abatement and the replacement with the alternative volumetric tax are subject to the developer meeting a series of eligibility conditions. And the way this would work is the commissioner of the Department of Revenue would issue a determination that the developer has made these commitments, and then that would in turn make the project subject for the alternative volumetric tax. So the developer has to commit to a $40 million deposit into a municipal impact grant fund with provisions for additional deposits up to a total of $80 million to support impacts of the project and development on municipalities. The developer has to commit to negotiate a project labor agreement for the gas pipeline portion of the project. And the developer has to commit to construct a Fairbanks spur line with several specific provisions around exactly what that spur line commitment is. And those are outlined on
was that so
slide
difficult?
11. So the spur line the plans for the spur line must be sized to meet projected demand, must plan to begin operation within 2 years of a commercial operation of a component of the AKLNG project, needs to connect into local infrastructure in the Fairbanks market. So there's been some talk of the potential, some speculation that a spur line could potentially bypass the local market and go to an industrial customer or military base. Under these conditions, the plans have to connect into the local Fairbanks infrastructure. And costs must be allocated system-wide. And so what this means is
that's a big deal.
Amortization of those capital costs for developing the Fairbanks spur line, those won't be paid just by Fairbanks residents, and they won't be paid just by Alaska residents, as in a previous version of the bill. In the current version of the bill, they're allocated across all customers, including export customers. And then the owner is responsible for permitting, going through the permitting and regulatory process before completion of 730 miles of the pipeline, which basically means before the completion of phase 1 of the project. And then within a year of receiving the required permits and approvals, they have to actually or make the commitment that they'll actually begin construction on that project.
Mr. Stickle, on the second to the last bullet point, allocates related costs system-wide. We've heard testimony at this table that the RCA will not set up a structure to levy those statewide costs. How would they be collected? Who would set those rates?
And we learned why, because the RCA does not have jurisdiction. That's why they're not going to do it. Federal government has jurisdiction.
Mr. Chairman, I can't comment on what the RCA would and would not approve. I would defer that question to RCA. The way the bill works is that the cost of the Fairbanks spur line would essentially be counted as a capital cost across the entire project. And what that would do is it would increase the levelized cost of gas in our baseline modeling by about 1 to 2 cents per 1,000 cubic feet for all customers. And that would be Fairbanks, South Central, that would be export customers.
Senator Stedman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If we only end up with phase 1, is there an estimate for what this gas would cost Fairbanks at the burner tip?
Sure. Co-Chair Stedman, so we have done analysis, and we have detailed analysis coming up later in the presentation that looks at gas break-even prices. I don't know if we've done a phase 1 specific analysis in this project. We assume that Fairbanks and South Central would pay a similar amount of gas price, so we are modeling in that if it's phase 1 only, the Fairbanks spur line would still be allocated across statewide.
And I might be getting ahead of myself, Mr. Stickle, but what is the timeline for start of construction and completion? Is that outlined in the piece of legislation before us?
Mr. Chairman, so the legislation before us outlines some deadlines for on slide 12, which is actually the next slide. The alternative volumetric tax would terminate if construction is not begun by 2032, and it would terminate if at least one component of the project has not come into operation by 2037. So those are that's kind of the timeline framework that's required under the bill to be eligible for the tax. Our baseline modeling assumes that construction would start either late this year or early next year, and gas would be flowing in 2029 for in-state and then 2031 for export gas, and would defer to AGDC and the developer as to whether those are still the current timelines that they're working off of.
Questions from the committee? Please proceed, Mr. Stickle.
All right, so slide 12 walks through some of the property tax changes. So as I mentioned, what this bill would do is it would replace some of the state and municipal property taxes with a temporary abatement period followed by imposition of a new alternative volumetric tax. And that alternative volumetric tax would apply to all three components of the AKLNG project: the gas treatment plant on the north slope, the gas pipeline from the north slope to South Central and then on to Nikiski, and then the LNG export plant in Nikiski. And there have been different versions of this bill that there were some versions on the House side that would only apply the tax to the pipeline component. The final version as passed the House does apply the tax to all three of the major components.
For those of you just joining us, we're listening to Dan Stickle with Department of Revenue talk to the Senate Finance Committee about HB 381 that got passed from the House to the Senate this weekend. And this is a review or an overview of what that bill that the House passed is for the Senate's consideration.
And then, as I mentioned, to be eligible for the alternative volumetric tax, in addition to the eligibility criteria that the Revenue Commissioner would sign off on that I mentioned earlier, the construction of the first phase of the gas pipeline has to begin by 2032, and at least one component of the project has to be completed and commence commercial operations by 2037. This would most likely be the gas pipeline, at least for in-state use, by 2037.
Questions on slide 12? Senator Keel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Stickle, can you then give us a sense of the outer bounds of what property is subject to the AVT and not to local property taxes? How far can that stretch?
Sure. Senator Keel, through the chair. So this is fairly narrowly limited to the AKLNG project. And in fact, there's intent language in the bill that this doesn't set a precedent for future taxation beyond the project. So it really is the gas treatment plant, the pipeline, and the export facility.
Senator Keel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So does the bill say it must handle gas?
Senator Keel, through the chair, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Senator Keel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How about business personal property or real property that does not handle gas, like office buildings? If not office buildings, what about warehouses? What are the outer bounds of the exemption?
Sure. Senator Keel, through the chair, and that really gets beyond my expertise. I don't know if we have someone from Department of Law here. I know we've had them previously to speak to some of those hypotheticals on exactly where that line is drawn. Be happy to provide some information back to the committee as well.
We will have that forwarded to the Department of Law.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just note that through some of my history, both here in the Capitol and in municipal government, it's pretty good. We know what it means. It's never good enough on tax law. You have to have the words on the paper.
Thank you, Senator Keel.
Now's the time to ask the question.
Please proceed.
Sure, and again, to that comment, I would note there's a definitions section in the bill that does lay out a statutory definition for the project, as well as the treatment plant, pipeline, and gas plant. But again, as to where where exactly that very fine technical line would get drawn, I'm an economist, not an auditor or lawyer, so would defer those very technical determinations. So slide 13 starts to talk about the fiscal note estimates for the property tax changes. So the major gas commercialization and the AKLNG project conservatively are not part of our official revenue forecast. That's been a long-standing protocol of the Department of Revenue. And so under the official revenue forecast, there's not a revenue impact from the property tax change itself. We do provide for the committee's benefit what the estimated property tax revenues from the midstream, which is the AKLNG project, would be to the state under our baseline modeling assumptions. And so these are based on the $46.2 billion real capital cost, which is our baseline capital cost assumption for the project. There has been some recent material, new information released by the developer that is basically the low end of their range of potential capital costs. But if the project were to proceed without tax modifications under current law, property tax revenue to the state would be estimated at $24 million initially in 2029, ramping up to $239 million by 2033, which is when the full export operations begin and the project construction is completed.
This is where people get their panties in a wad, because $239 million seems like, well, I would rather have that than what they're going to show us with a property tax abatement or a move to a 2 mil equivalent AVT. But this is not possible because the project is not going to be built. The project's developer is not the only one saying this. It is industry experts and the consultants that we have paid for are telling us this is what it's that our current tax structure is cost prohibitive. It's not going to, the project will not be economical under the current tax regime. Okay, tax policy. So yes, Mr. Stickle has got to show, and the government has to show what current law, how this project would be impacted with current law. They have to show that because that's what current law is. But it's really meaningless because the project's never going to go forward under current law. So take it with a grain of salt. It doesn't mean that you're giving something up. You're not giving it up because you don't have a pipeline. You don't have a project built. If everything was built and then we're having the conversation about what the tax structure would be, then you would say, okay, well, we've got something built. And now it's just a decision as to whether you can put gas through it under this current tax structure, right? That's not the case. You need to get it built. It's not going to get built under current tax structures. You got to do something about that.
And then the municipal revenues, in addition to those state revenues, would start at $50 million initially in 2029, ramping up to $497 million in 2033. So all told, you have a little over $700 million per year of property tax revenue that would come just from the AKLNG project to the state and municipalities if the project were to proceed under current law. And that represents the significant revenue source that we are reducing under this bill, also represents the significant economic burden that the developer is facing without this bill.
Senator Stedman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just need some clarity on the bottom 4 bullets. So if we just look at the pipeline, and this is referencing, Mr. Chairman, this is referencing 2 municipalities. So what you said under the, what value are you using? Because for the pipeline, because it's taxed at 20 mils under current law after construction, is that correct? And then what value are you using?
Co-Chair Stedman, that's correct. We're assuming the 20 mils property tax, and trying to see if I have the pipeline value at my fingertips.
Well, they showed us, Mr. Chairman, if I could, they showed us a low, this is slide 9 on the CapEx, low value of 13 billion two and a high value of 16.9 for capital costs. But, and that's without contingencies or anything. So what, I'm just wondering what you're basing 20 mils on.
So this highlights a very good point. Before the project is built, before the decision is made in the legislature on this tax proposal, before anything, before we even get to the starting line and get to run this race, a question is being asked about the numbers that DOR is forecasting, not forecasting, but they're projecting, they're assuming this is what the revenue would be under current law. The question is, well, what's the value? What value are you using? Meaning, how much is it going to cost the pipeline to be built right now? That's what the value, that's the only way to measure the value of the pipeline, right? How much money is it going to cost to build the pipeline? Okay. Once the pipeline's built, then there's a conversation about what the value of the pipeline is, and that changes over time. So before the project even gets off the ground and before we even get started, there's some variation and some disagreement over what the cost of the project's going to be, what the value of the pipeline is. And that disagreement and questioning of the value is going to carry forward after the project gets going. As long as there's a mechanism, as long as there's a reason for questioning, for increasing revenue based on questioning of the value, you're creating the incentive for someone to sue to get that valuation changed so that there's more revenue coming to the state, or vice versa. The person who's paying the tax sues because the valuation is too much and they want to pay less in tax. You're creating a structure that's going to force that, not force it, but it's going to enable it to happen going forward. And that means you pay higher prices of gas because that cost of doing business gets lumped into the cost of gas in the future. Okay, it's a cost of doing business. The contract that you sign for long term has to account for that. So you want to sign a contract going forward for the cheapest possible gas. Don't include litigation right off the bat. That's going to happen. It's happening with TAPS right now. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline is going, and it has for the life of the pipeline, has been fought in court over what the valuation of the pipeline is. So we can talk about how much the state's going to get off of revenue. Well, you're not going to get anything off of revenue if the pipeline doesn't get built. And if you create a tax structure that enables lawsuits to question the value of the project, maybe even before we get off the ground, you're creating hurdles that aren't necessary. There are better ways to collect state revenue, and this model, this change to an volumetric tax is the way to reduce this risk and eliminate the lawsuits and the fighting over the valuation of the pipeline. He's asking a great question. It's highlighting the problem with the underlying tax structure, which is you got to agree upon the value of the pipeline every year. Every year you got to agree.
Sure, Co-Chair Stedman. So the numbers on slide 13 are all based on our quote unquote baseline capital cost assumptions, which is the $46.2 billion real capital cost. I believe the pipeline component of that is in the range of about 16 billion. I know we've broken that out in various documents. I don't happen to have that specific breakout document in front of me. Comparing the estimates that we are using in our baseline modeling to the to the estimates that were provided by the project developer either last week or the week before. They don't exactly line up in exactly how we're approaching those. So, I understand they're looking at the costs in terms of phase, where the first phase would include a portion of the pipeline and then potentially a portion of gas treatment costs, whereas we are looking at the costs strictly by component. So would caution against a direct comparison between what Glenfarne presented and what we presented, except for the total project cost should be comparable.
Senator Stedman.
Yeah, just to try to uncomplicate things so I can follow it. Yeah, I agree with you looking at the three component parts, the treatment plant, the pipe, and the LNG facility. But as stated earlier, the LNG facility is taxed at the local level. They're not at 20 mils. They're down around 7, something like that. And then the pipeline and the treatment plant at 20 mils, but it'd be nice if we could actually see the value you're using or estimating that, like, because we're concerned about the pipe, what's the estimated tax assessed value of that pipeline when it's built?
It's a moot point. It is a point that does not need to be talked about right now, if ever, because it is never going to apply. The pipeline is never going to get built under the current tax law. It's never going to get built. So you can spend time, waste time answering this question, and it's moot.
And, because that's going to be taxed at 20 mils, and then we can look at the comparison of the volumetric tax to see the marginal impact.
Sure, and Co-Chair Stedman, I know we've provided that throughout
Marginal
the process
impact.
several times. We'll be happy to provide those exact numbers to the committee.
Marginal impact. I think what he means is what we're going to lose. What is the impact of going to an AVT, an alternate volumetric tax, right? What's the impact? Meaning, get the numbers right so that we have an estimate of what the current tax regime is going to get us. What we're gonna get is as revenue, and then if we make a change to the AVT, what are we gonna get? And subtract the two numbers, and now you're gonna see what the difference is. That's what he's getting at. It's a moot point because the pipeline is not going to get built under the current tax structure. You are not faced with the decision is not a pipeline under current tax structure. It is not going to happen. It's not going to happen. You're setting yourself up for a conversation that confuses people, yourself included, by comparing what the current statute, which was drafted and written and adopted before there was even a consideration of a gas pipeline and infrastructure like this. It doesn't matter. It does not matter one bit. What would be more helpful for everybody in this room is to think about setting tax policy brand new. Just push it out of your head what the actual statute says right now, because you don't get a project with that. Now have a conversation about what the tax policy needs to be in order to help a project move forward. That's the conversation that needs to be had. You're confusing yourself by looking at what's currently in statute.
I believe the estimated capital cost and therefore assessed value of the pipeline that we're using in our baseline modeling is in the range of $16 billion. We do have some slides at the end of the committee or at the end of the presentation that walk through an example of the alternative volumetric tax calculation based on a different CapEx number. We were asked to model a higher $54.5 billion real capital cost assumption by the committee. In that scenario, the allocated portion to the pipeline was $19.76 billion.
Right.
Senator Stedman.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm more focused on just the gas line itself to get a handle on that. I understand that there's 2 other component parts coming potentially in phase 2. So I think 2 mills of our 2% of 16 billion is somewhere around 320 million. So I just need to, I guess, get some of these numbers adjusted. And I'd rather, Mr. Chairman, have us look at the aggregate dollars and going to the state. And then if there's a split to the municipalities, like we do with our oil tax, we look at the whole, the portion that goes to each borough and then the portion that goes to the state. But if we don't use the aggregate dollar amount, we get our tax modeling off. I'm just trying to keep things synchronized because it just appears 20 mills, there's quite a bit of spread here, and I need to get that clarified because I'd like to get a good handle on the marginal difference with the current tax structure versus whatever volumetric numerics we're going to use in dollars.
Mr. Stickle, can that be provided to the committee?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we will follow up with some detailed numbers.
Senator Stedman.
No, that's,
Thank you, Senator Stedman. Further questions of the Finance Committee? Mr. Stickle.
All right, moving on to slide 14. So this is the alternative volumetric tax that this bill would put in place in replacement of those property taxes that we just talked about for both the state and municipal level, assuming the project meets the various criteria outlined in the bill. So there would be a temporary tax abatement period. So there would be 0 tax paid for either the first 5 years of commercial operations or until project throughput reaches 500 million cubic feet per day. Property tax is not due during construction under current law as long as AGDC is involved in the project. And so this bill would extend that exemption from property tax to effectively apply during phase 1 of the project. And that throughput number, so there's been various iterations of the bill that use different throughput numbers. Under the bill before the committee, the alternative volumetric tax for all components of the project, there's a single definition of throughput, and it is throughput of natural gas through the gas pipeline. And that is specifically defined in the bill as the volume of gas leaving the gas pipeline. And what that means is any fuel gas used in the gas treatment plant or the pipeline itself ends up not subject to tax because that's used before the measurement point of the tax, which is leaving the gas pipeline. But then all gas delivered into the in-state market or into the LNG plant, all of that gas, including LNG plant fuel gas, would be subject to the tax. The tax rate has a formula that has a few moving pieces and parts to it, and I'll attempt to explain this in a simplified fashion here, and then we also have several slides at the end of the presentation that walk through this. So there's a headline tax rate for each component of the project. And that headline tax rate is 6 cents per 1,000 cubic feet for the gas pipeline, 13 cents per 1,000 cubic feet for the gas treatment plant, and 13 cents per 1,000 cubic feet for the LNG export plant. Now, that does not mean that all gas going through the gas treatment plant or the LNG plant pays a 13-cent tariff. What we actually do is we take those headline rates times the capital expenditures spent to date on that portion of the project, and we do that calculation for the pipeline, treatment plant, and LNG plant, and then we divide that sum by the total capital expenditures to get effectively a weighted average tax rate. And so that that total tax rate paid by the project would be somewhere between 6 cents and 13 cents per 1,000 cubic feet. Effectively, what this approach will do is during phase one, it's going to be a lower tax rate, presumably heavily weighted towards the 6 cents on the gas pipeline, potentially with some initial treatment costs in there. But then once the full export project comes online, that weighted average tax rate is going to be a little bit higher. We calculate based on our assumptions that the effective rate would be somewhere between 10 and 11 cents per 1,000 cubic feet. And again, have some examples later on in the presentation that go through those. Those tax rates would all be inflation adjusted based on CPI inflation, except that they must increase by at least 1% per year and can't increase by more than 2% per year. So under our modeling, effectively, we assume the 2% annual escalation to those headline ABT rates.
So, Mr. Stickle, what would the benefits be on a weighted average methodology versus a flat rate? The pros and cons.
Sure. Mr. Chairman, I would defer some of that discussion to AGDC and the developer.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
So he's asking a policy question. What is good and bad about the technical piece, right? Dan Stickle is the technical guy. He's just presenting the technical piece of it. So he doesn't want to get into a situation where he places himself in a position where somebody's like, well, that was Dan's opinion on what is good and bad about this. He doesn't want that. He's like, I am the nonpartisan. I am the state employee, and I'm here just presenting the facts and answering your questions factually. You want an understanding of what's good or bad because you don't understand what I'm saying. you don't get it. So you want someone to tell you why this is good or why this is bad. Well, then you need to go talk to somebody else. Go talk to the project sponsor, the developer, and they'll tell you why it's good because they want the bill to be passed, right? Hire a consultant to tell you why it's bad, or find somebody to tell you why it's bad. Go talk to Wilikowski. He'll tell you why it's bad. Anyway, Dan's a true professional. He's like, I'm not going to answer that question.
Senator Stedman, did you have a question?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
And Senator Keel.
I was wondering if we can get a rough percentage of the shrinkage, trying to get a grasp of some of these numbers. And then I'm struggling with why inflation would be limited at 2% when historic inflation is 2.5%, maybe a little bit more with the last uptick the last few years. But it seems to me like that won't even keep up with inflation.
Mr. Stickle, do you have a response or?
Talk to the House.
Senator Stedman, is that a statement?
They're the ones that
Stedman,
passed the bill.
Under our baseline projections, you're correct. The 2% would limit the exposure to tax increase to the developer. We do assume a 2.5% inflation rate in our modeling. And so the assumption that we use in our modeling is that in real terms, that tax rate would actually be declining over time, even though it's increasing in nominal terms.
Senator Stedman.
Yeah, that is a concern. And then the shrinkage, the amount of gas going in the top of the pipe and the amount of gas we're actually measuring for our tax, property tax replacement. Do we have any shrinkage numbers roughly or ballpark?
Sure, Co-Chair Stedman. So I don't have those exact numbers with me for the fuel, gas, and shrinkage. We'll be happy to provide those to the committee.
Okay, Rick, got a good question. Let's pause here for this. Rick asked, what exactly are they paying property tax on? Does the ground the pipeline set on get turned over to Glenfarne or substations? Yeah, so any of the property that is owned by the project developer or the owner of the project, whoever has ownership of the ground and the equipment that gets put in the ground, the infrastructure, that's the pipeline, the pipe, the steel, the brackets, the machinery, the electrical pumps, electrical generation, whatever it is, whatever infrastructure is built that didn't exist on the land, that's all part of the property that gets taxed. Pipeline, and then you've got the plant that gets built on the north slope and the plant that gets built on the south slope, on South Central Alaska down in Nikiski. All of the infrastructure that gets built, that's what gets applied to, or gets the property tax applied to. Okay, it's not any different than the property tax that gets applied to the facilities that exist down here in Nikiski right now, or whatever's built up on the slope. It's all whatever qualifies as infrastructure for, and I'm sure that in the statute it spells out exactly what is defined as infrastructure, what is property, real property for the tax. If the question you're really asking is about the ground or the land, then yeah, I'm assuming that there is land that they own. Like I know that they own land down here in Nikiski. They've already purchased it. And so that there would be a property valuation on that. But the pipeline along the route, I don't know whether they own the land that it's sitting on, or whether they're leasing it, or it's in a right of way, or what. I'm not entirely sure. But if the land is owned by the project and the project owner, the pipeline owner, then yeah, they would get taxed on that land as well. If it's running across land that they don't own, then they're likely not paying property tax on it. If it goes across state land, for example, then they're not going to pay property tax on state land. If they stop paying property tax, what happens? Like you stop paying property tax. Well, that's a really big what if. Like I don't think that they're going to not pay property tax, but they would get sued in court, I guess. And I don't know how far to take that. I mean, I don't know. Like, I don't think that they're going, I don't know. If they don't pay their property tax, then I would assume the state at some point in time owns their property. So big incentive for them to pay their property tax. I don't think that's going to be an issue. There's a question here, Craig. I wanted to hit this before we got too far on. Does the Senate majority have some kind of strategy to force Governor Dunleavy to lift his veto on defined benefits prior to passing a gasline bill? I'm not sure, but I don't think the governor gets to lift his veto. He's already issued the veto. It's a one and done. It's vetoed. It's done. The legislature attempted to override it and it failed. It's done. A second bill would have to come across his desk, and then he would have to choose to adopt it or let it become law. So I don't think that that's even possible at this point. Like, I don't think he can rescind his action because there's already been a vote to override the veto, and it's done. It's done. What's done is done. So I don't think that's an issue. Mike says, you can see the frustration on Mr. Stickles' face. Yeah, possibly, but it could be that he's had a long weekend too. I don't know. I of all the people that brief, I think Dan does the best job that I've seen and that I experienced on staying unemotional, not getting wrapped up in emotions with dumb questions and things like that. But it's got to weigh on him. Absolutely has to. Brian's trying to answer the question for you there, Rick. Says the state would probably place a tax lien, eventually go to court, and likely be able to collect from sales of gas. Yeah, there's a process there for them to get their money. The state's going to get their money one way or the other. They're going to get their tax. I guess if the gas stops flowing, then ultimately you would own the project and you would sell it for scrap. I don't know. You're gonna get some value from it because you're the taxing authority. All right, back to it.
Senator Stedman?
No,
Thank you, Senator Stedman. Senator Keel?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Stickler, you said throughput is defined as the amount out the bottom end of whatever element we're working with. Does that mean the gas that gets delivered down the Fairbanks spur is not part of this calculation? Or it is counted exactly the same as gas burned in Homer? How does that work?
Senator Keel, through the chair, the latter. So it would be taxed the same regardless of where the gas is burned. So the measuring, the bill defines throughput based on outlet, gas that leaves an outlet of the gas pipeline. It specifically clarifies that gas into a compressor station is not part of that definition, but essentially gas to the Fairbanks spur line, gas into South Central, gas into the LNG export plant. If there were to be any other additional spur lines or offtake plants, you would sum up all of those, all of that gas leaving the gas pipeline component, and that would be the definition of throughput.
Senator Keel?
Thank you. That's helpful. This is such a complicated way to do this. So I'm interested in, I think Senator Stedman called it shrinkage. I'll call it fuel gas or gas that's not subject to this, and the proportions of how much gets used where. And what the reason I'm asking is what that means in economic terms for who's benefiting from this particular tax treatment. Now, give you an example of what I mean. Every unit of gas, except what powers the gas treatment plant itself, comes out of the gas treatment plant. So functionally, all of it is subject to the proportional piece of 13 cents on the slope. But less gas than that comes out of the pipeline because you power a bunch of compressor stations. Even less gas than that comes out of the liquefaction plant for export. So, I mean, should I look at this structure as being built in a way that grossly benefits the North Slope disproportionately? Should I look at this as disadvantaging the Kenai Peninsula Borough, because even though they have the entire liquefaction plant there, this alternative to property tax has them paying for, in essence, everything that goes through gas treatment, but not everything that goes through liquefaction. Help me think that through just in conceptual terms.
Sure, Senator Keel. So,
yeah, it disadvantages them because the tax that they're getting now is zero, and the tax that they get when the pipeline gets built and the liquefaction plant gets built, the tax is more than zero. So they are severely disadvantaged.
The way I would look at it, there's a lot of complexity, as you mentioned. There's a lot of moving pieces. I would look at the bottom line numbers. At the end of the day, cash on the table. How much is going to the various municipalities? How much is going to the state? How much is going to the developer? And what are the economics of that? And what we'll actually see when I get to the appendix slides is we have two different bills that have taken a slightly different way of splitting up the pie, and some of the, even though they have that same definition of throughput, some of the impacts at the end of the day to the municipalities can actually be counterintuitive. So I would look at that. I would look at that bottom line number at the end of the day.
Senator Keel?
Mr. Chairman, I will take Mr. Stickle's advice to also look at the bottom line and where the cash goes. But I have found over time that Alaskans are interested in who's helping support what, and whether that is ever out of proportion to their benefit. sometimes we do that, and sometimes we say it goes too far. So I'm interested in that notion with this novel approach.
I don't even know what you're talking about anymore. Keep in mind that there's another dynamic here that people ought to just keep in mind here. Senator Keel is of the legislative branch. Dan Stickle is an employee of the executive branch. There is a separation of power here between both branches of government. Governor Dunleavy and his administration is wanting a pipeline. The administration is putting forward their best assessment of what this bill is going to require them to do, their interpretation, if you will, of what this bill is going to require them to do. And the legislator of the legislative branch is asking the executive branch, please tell me what this is going to do. There's a separation of powers. That's why you hire a consultant, and that's why you would hope that somebody elects somebody with some subject matter expertise, but that isn't the case here. So you're going to have to go pay for advice from some subject matter expert to give you objective information, because what you're getting from the executive branch may not be completely objective with your own perspectives. Okay. Because you're a separate branch. All right. So I agree with what Dan's saying, but if Senator Keel wants to make his own point, he needs to go get his own subject matter expert and bring that to the table. Some of these questions are leading and trying to get at an opinion or a direction that he wants to go with a conversation from the executive branch, they're not obligated to go down that road. This is our interpretation of how this bill is going to be implemented. The what ifs, go find your own subject matter expert to build your what if case. Don't waste the executive branch's time on this. It's not his business. He's just telling you what the facts are.
Opposed to, there's this much property here, and they get a piece of the value. There's that much property there, and they get a piece of the value, which is pretty straightforward.
Yeah, and certainly, Senator Keel, through the chair, so I'm hearing that it would be helpful to the committee to provide our assumptions, which were developed in collaboration with AGDC, around the volume of gas at each stage in the project. And so we're assuming something in the range of 3.5 billion cubic feet per day of gas going into the gas treatment plant, and around 3 billion cubic feet per day coming out of into the gas exports and in-state use. And certainly you could, for purposes of levying an alternative volumetric tax, you could levy that tax based on gas going into the treatment plant, gas coming out of the treatment plant, going into the pipeline, coming out of the pipeline. You could measure it anywhere along the pipeline. You could measure it based on gas going into the
or coloring with crayons
facility or coming out of the export facility, or you could do some combination of thereof. And we've seen many different combinations in the various permutations of this legislation. And you could achieve a similar level of revenue to the state and municipalities by, if you charge a slightly lower AVT on gas at the beginning of the project versus a slightly higher
Come on,
AVT
Mr.
of
Chairman,
gas at the
put
end
him
of
out
the
of his
project.
misery.
And we will provide the detailed throughput assumptions to the committee so you guys can play around with
Exasperation
that
a little
as you
bit.
please.
Further questions on slide 14?
I think he rolled his eyes
15,
there at
Mr.
the
Stickle.
end. Just a little bit.
All right. And so we talked about how the alternative volumetric tax is calculated under this version of the bill with that kind of weighted average approach. And then slide 15 shows how that revenue would be distributed. And so under this version of the bill, the state would levy and collect the alternative volumetric tax. The municipalities would have the option to elect to have the state collect and share that as a shared tax back with the municipalities, but that would not be done automatically. So if I could see a situation where a significant municipality would choose to collect the tax themselves, and a municipality that has a smaller portion of the tax may elect to just have the state collect it and share it. That revenue would be allocated under component-specific rules. So this would be a series of calculations that would be performed by the Department of Revenue. And then we would use those to either allocate and share revenue back to the municipalities, or we would tell the municipalities on a regular basis what their share of the alternative volumetric tax is, so that they can go forth and levy that tax themselves. For alternative volumetric tax for the gas treatment plant, 93% of the tax attributable to the treatment plant, and this is based on capital expenditures. So we first do this calculation where we come up with the total tax revenue, and then we use the total amount of capital expenditures that have been expended to date on each portion of the project, being the treatment plant, pipeline, and LNG export facility, to share out that total revenue from the alternative volumetric tax into the three components. For the gas treatment facility component, for that allocated share of the AVT, 93% of that goes to the North Slope Borough, 7% is retained by the state. The same 93 and 7 share for the AVT allocated to the LNG plant. For that AVT allocated to the pipeline, that is allocated 50% by mileage and 50%. So the first 50%, which is allocated by mileage, that it simply goes to the various municipalities that the pipe runs through, with the state retaining the unorganized borough share of that. With the remaining 50% of that pipeline share of the alternative volumetric tax, that is distributed by Department of Commerce statewide in a community revenue sharing sort of formula.
Is that an incentive for boroughs to organize? Wouldn't that be great?
So the amount that goes to the state from the unorganized areas, boroughs, where does those dollars end up? In the general fund?
General fund.
Co-chair Hoffman, yes, those would be unrestricted general fund revenues, similar to how property tax is handled on oil and gas property in the unorganized borough presently.
Senator Stedman, and I mentioned this because we're trying to control costs in the rail belt and other areas of the state. But the unorganized areas of the state, as Senator Cronk and Senator Olson well know, energy costs in rural Alaska are potentially 10 times higher than the rail belt. Please proceed.
Another question.
Senator Stedman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you explain to us how the oil tax property tax structure works when we're dealing with that? And then why we'd want to structure this different than that?
Co-chair Stedman, so the oil and gas property tax is the standard 20 mils or 2% property tax on all oil and gas property in the state that we mentioned.
He can't believe he's
earlier
answering
in
this
the
question
presentation.
again.
That is the property tax that applies to the oil pipeline that we have in place.
Heavy sigh.
The change to the approach, I mean, that's a policy decision. The key thing that does is it reduces the tax to the developer and improves the project economics.
I'm asking for clarity. So if I'm, an oil company and I have that tax, who do I send the check to? And how does it end up in the general fund or end up in the North Slope Borough or wherever the end person? Help me with that process.
Sure, Co-Chair Stedman. So the state assesses the value and appraises the value of all the oil and gas property. We levy a 20 mils property tax on that property. The way it works in practice is we allow a tax credit for municipal taxes paid. And so if, for instance, in the North Slope Borough, about 90% of the assessed tax goes to the borough. And so an oil and gas taxpayer would file a tax return with us as the Department of Revenue. They would take a tax credit for the 90% that they paid to the North Slope Borough, and then they would send a check to us at the state, typically an ACH or a wire transfer for the remaining 10%, and then that would go to our Treasury Division and our general fund.
And then, Mr. Chairman, if I could, so then when you report to us with the revenue source book, you show the aggregate amount, but a breakdown between the borough and the state.
Co-Chair Stedman, so in the revenue numbers that we present as state revenue, we're including only the state's, the net unrestricted general fund portion of the revenue to the state. We are not including the value to the municipalities that's allowed as a tax
The money
credit.
that
We do
didn't
have a
come to the state?
supplemental table in our oil and gas chapter that shows those for informational purposes, but they don't roll up into any of the revenue numbers that we report, because those municipal revenues do not ever actually touch the state treasury.
Senator Stedman.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And that's the point I'm trying to make, is that we've got a system in place that we're all familiar with on collection and distribution of the property tax, and and any deviation from that is needs to be well understood.
Don't change. Don't change. Don't change. I see the change coming. Avoid the change. Hide quick. The change is just around the corner. Let's hide quick. Everybody be quiet. Maybe it won't see us.
Sure, Co-Chair Stedman. So the default for the alternative volumetric tax to the first bullet point here would be that it would work. So there's two options, and it's basically a municipal option. So we do have the current property tax approach, which is where the municipalities would collect their tax and the state would collect its tax. There's also an option for a shared tax, and we do that through several taxes. So we have shared taxes that we administer for fisheries taxes in particular, are a big one, where half of our fisheries business tax and landing tax is shared out to communities.
Now, maybe there's a little bit more clarity on why a long-term fiscal plan is so damn difficult in this legislature. Change. What was the phrase that I used to use? Overcoming the inertia to do nothing is very, very difficult. Like, we do not want to change a dang thing. Not anything we don't want to change. Unless it gives us more money. Then we'll talk about change. We don't want to change anything. Overcoming the inertia to do nothing is very, very difficult. That's what we're witnessing here tonight. But we've got this set up and we all understand it. So why would we want to change it? What would be the pros and the cons of that? Do you want a pipeline or do you not want a pipeline? So, I mean, you're talking to legislators that from the panhandle of the state that aren't going to ever get gas from this. Do you want a pipeline or do you not want a pipeline? That's why you change. And then you just get used to the new normal. When they stole the dividend, when they went away from the statutory dividend and they created a new law, Senate Bill, what was it, 21? Oh, I forget the number. Anyway, the POMV, percent of market value, that was something new. We've got this old way of doing it. We've got a statutory formula that we've been following for decades. But that's not working anymore. So we're going to go create a new statute, and we're going to figure out how to do the dividend a different way because we want more money. We'll figure that out. We'll be okay with that. We don't want a pipeline, so we don't care whether we have a pipeline. It doesn't get gas to us. So what do we care? We don't want to change. I want to go home. I want to go to my boat. It's disappointing, to say the least.
There's several other taxes that are handled like that. And so we're certainly prepared to handle that either way at the municipal election.
Senator Stedman.
Again, just for clarity, why I think this is important is many, many times at the table over the years, we'll be talking about our oil tax revenue, and we're only talking about the portion that the state receives. And it's one of our components in our government share, where in all our economic modeling and the industry looks at the total dollars paid, they don't care if it ends up in our general fund or the general fund of the North Slope Borough. It's just money they don't have. So I think that clarity needs to be maintained, because we've spent many meetings over the years as members change in the legislature, getting that understanding across the table, because there's two sets of numbers. One's with the municipal share and one's without.
Thank you, Senator Stedman.
Making a mountain out of a molehill.
Keel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for coming in, but Mr. Stickle repeated a phrase on this slide that he used on the prior slide, and it triggered something in my thinking. Mr. Stickle, you talked about figuring out the split on this alternate tax based on capital expenditure, I think you said to date or so far or at that point. And it got me thinking, and I looked in the bill, and a capital expenditure has to be actual, but it could be anything to acquire, construct, or improve a project. So can you talk to us about the threshold for that? I mean, I imagine that the easiest example would be we're wildly successful. It's time to add more LNG to the pipe, or more gas to the pipe. And the pipe owners come in and they add compression and looping, and that has a cost. But same question, right? What are the other bounds on an improvement?
Sure, Senator Keel through the chair. So
How do you say I don't know anything about private business without saying I don't know anything about private business? If you spend capital money improving your business, you get to write it off.
we would have to, under the current version of the bill, we would have to provide explicit definitions around capital expenditure, probably through regulations. So we do have, some existing capital expenditure definitions that we could look at. We may look at definitions for production tax purposes or corporate income tax purposes, but that's a definition that we would have to come up with as we administer the bill. For purposes of modeling, it's more of a, you know it when you see it. So we have a established, here's the construction cost for the project, here's the operating cost. We've developed those assumptions in collaboration with AGDC. That's what we've plugged into our modeling.
And then Senator Keel.
Hey, Rick, let this be a lesson to you and to everyone else. You don't need to be a genius to get elected. To do this job, you don't need to be a genius. You just got to be able to get elected. That's it. You don't have to know what you're talking about. Isn't that scary? The lady that is showing up, who's got the yellow notepad, I do not know her name, but she has been talking with the folks from Glenfarne. So she's probably a scribe or a secretary or an administrative assistant or project manager or something. I don't know what her title is, but she's working with Glenfarne.
Just to follow up, it's Mox next to the developer, right? Because this is just a proportion of how much goes to which muni. They're in the end not going to pay any more, or could they?
Senator Keel, through the chair, so the capital expenditures do matter for how much the actual tax will be, given that we have differing headline tax rates for each of the three components of the project. And then those are, the total tax is essentially a weighted average tax rate of those three different headline tax rates based on the weighted average value of capital expenditures. And those weighted averages would change each year until the final construction is complete. And so the capital expenditures on each piece of the project would have a modest impact on the tax paid by the developer, as well as impacting the tax allocated to each municipality.
Senator Keel.
It is confusing.
Yeah, I apologize, Mr. Chairman. Until the construction is complete, I thought under this bill there is no AVT until 5 years after construction and gas starts flowing.
Senator Keel, through the chair, so the AVT doesn't kick in until 500 million cubic feet per day or 5 years. What we assume is that when the pipeline starts flowing 500 million cubic feet per day, there's still money being spent. So we're modeling that there's actually 3 trains of LNG production, with the first train coming online in 2029 or 2031, the second in 2032, and the third in 2033. There could potentially be some additional costs that extend beyond that. And then, you know, an outstanding question is how we would handle something like a further expansion of the project. And so we would, when the first component of the project comes into production, we would calculate the tax rate at that time, and then we would continue to calculate that tax rate each year, and it would be a recalculation as different amounts of money are spent on the different components. And so from the point in time that the project starts paying the tax, when they exceed either that 5-year or 500 million cubic feet threshold, to the point at time when they have completed all capital expenditures on the project, as defined in the bill and our regulations, we would expect that effective tax rate to change.
Dan Stickle, the man, Alaska's chief economist, so good he can ask himself a really good question and then answer it. I love this guy. He's great.
Further questions on slide 15? We'll move on to slide 16.
All right, so slide 16 is more information about the alternative volumetric tax. So this outlines our estimated revenues from the AVT during the fiscal note time horizon under our baseline modeling assumptions that I've been just describing. So we look at, under our baseline modeling, 2031 is the first year of exports when the first train comes online, and that would be the first year of tax liability for the alternative volumetric tax, with a total of $39 million paid in, and that would increase to $131 million by 2033, which would be the first year of the full export operations. And that 131 million then would increase by the 2% annual inflation adjustment thereafter. Under this version of the bill, the state would receive about 9% of the total AVT revenue, with the remainder allocated to the various municipalities and communities as outlined in this bill. And so the net unrestricted revenue to the state would be $4 million in 2031, increasing to $12 million by 2033.
Okay, so we're approaching the end of this conversation with this review or overview of the HB 381 that the House passed the Senate, and this is where you get to the projection or estimation of the money that is actually going to flow into the coffers if the bill was passed and the project went forward. $39 million in 2031, $131 million in 2033. So this is where you say to yourself, do we want $131 million in 2033? Not, we're giving up $600 million from a 20 mil property tax. The difference between whatever the property tax is going to get us in this 131 in 2033, that's what we're giving up. No, that's the wrong way to be looking at it, because the project is never going to get built under the old or the current model. So what you really have to ask yourself is, do we want $131 million in 2033 or do we not? That's it. That's the question you got before you. Because that's, as we'll hear, the project, and as what I've heard, is the project developer, Glenfarne, is okay with this version of the bill. At least somewhat okay. All right. They're gonna take a break here in just a minute, and then we're gonna jump to the conclusions.
Stedman.
Again, I'll need some help on this. So on the first bullet, the 131 million, and that's the aggregate alternative volumetric tax, correct? There's no, that's the aggregate number coming in to be split between whoever gets it, the municipalities or the state?
Co-Chair Stedman, correct. That's the total AVT, whether it goes to the municipalities or state, is the 131.
And then it, and what millage equivalency would that be relative to what dollar value would someone be looking at there to get in that 131 million ballpark range?
Co-Chair Stedman, so through the chair, so the equivalent millage rate would be, we have an example. It doesn't exactly line out to this, but it would be about, in our example, it would be about 2.1 mils, and that's on slide 44 of the presentation.
And that's, okay, so I can get my calculator, but and we could wait for that, but it's, what is the total dollars assessed value then that to get to that 2.1 mils?
Co-Chair Stedman, so we would assume for the 2.1, we assumed a $54.5 billion capital cost. That was the specific scenario that we were requested to run by the committee.
That's fine, Mr. Chairman. It just, because sometimes these numbers just get meaningless. And I've got to benchmark them against something.
Sure. And under our baseline capital cost.
Talk about meaningless numbers. How about the numbers that apply to a tax that is never going to be levied because a pipeline never gets built? Them numbers, them is meaningless.
Cost assumptions, since you'd have a very similar AVT revenue compared to a lower assessed value, that effective mill rate would actually be a little bit higher under our baseline assumptions.
Thank you. Further questions on slide 16? Slide 17.
All right, so fund and revenue provisions. So this bill creates a municipal impact grant fund administered by the Department of Commerce, Community and Economic Development. That would consist of up to $80 million paid in by the developer. So they would make an initial $40 million payment into the fund that DCCED would use to administer grants to impacted communities. And then upon request, DCCED can request additional funds in $10 million increments up to a total of $80 million for additional verified or anticipated impacts on municipalities. And we list out the municipalities that would be eligible for this would be the North Slope Borough, the Fairbanks Borough, Denali Borough, Municipality of Anchorage, Matsu Borough, and Kenai Peninsula Borough.
So obviously this is going to be a contentious thing, or could be a contentious thing. Is that an $80 million piggy bank that each one of the boroughs just gets to dip into? No, it says verified, actual, or reasonably anticipated additional municipal impacts. So there is going to be some sort of regulation or further explanation, definition of what justifies a municipality's request for money for impact. What does it mean? What does impact mean? There's going to have to be a definition for that, obviously.
Page 18.
Slide 18 is some additional provisions of the bill. So the Regulatory Commission of Alaska, RCA, approval would be required for certain utility contracts.
This is a big deal.
Reserving capacity in the pipeline project. They may not.
Unless the bill said the Regulatory Commission doesn't have approval of utility contracts for this pipeline, right? The law could cut out the RCA in this scenario. They could just author it into the bill. Then you wouldn't have to wait on the RCA.
Not approve utility contracts that require customers to assume construction cost overruns for the project. That was a concern in previous committees. Gas sold to Alaska Utility.
You wouldn't have to put that into the legislation. You could just say utility contracts can't assume construction costs, and the law would state that you don't have to do that. You don't have to point to the RCA and say, RCA, you can't approve this. Just write it in the law that it's not, you can't include it in your contract. You don't need the RCA for this. You're doing the, oh my gosh.
Is subject to a $16 per million BTU price cap, roughly similar to the $16 per 1,000 cubic feet. And then there's an annual inflation adjustment for that. And so that $16 price cap lines out with the commitment that the developer has made on the record that they would be willing to cap prices at that level. There's semi-annual reports on the project that would be delivered to the legislature by AGDC, and then there's additional governance and transparency provisions relating to AGDC that they can speak to in more detail if desired.
Senator Keel.
Just briefly, Mr. Chairman, the $16 price cap adjusted annually for inflation, is that actual inflation or is that the same 1% to 2% range?
Senator Keel through the chair. So that's based on CPI. So it would be $16 in real terms would be the cap on prices for gas sold into Alaska utilities.
Senator Keel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would suggest that we should probably treat the price Alaskans are going to have to pay and the tax rate of developers going to have to pay with the same inflation adjusters.
Thank you, Senator Keel. With that, we've been going for about an hour. We're going to take a 5-minute break for the next.
All right, so we're going to jump into the meeting for the conclusions, and then we're going to see the comparison between the ABT and the mill rate that the Senate committee asked for Dan Stickle and the DOR folks to put together, because that's going to be important. And then we're going to hear from Glenfarne. Got my fingers clicked before it should have. Okay, so here we're reaching the conclusion of the briefing, so it'll kind of summarize for us what the portions that we didn't hear.
Project has potential to provide tens of billions of dollars to the state of Alaska, the federal government, local governments, as well as creating thousands of jobs and enhancing energy supply and energy security. The bill before the committee is a large tax decrease. As I mentioned earlier, it's not quite as significant a tax decrease as the bill introduced by the governor, which had the straight 6 cents per thousand cubic feet AVT on the whole project. But this is still a significant tax decrease that would materially impact the economics of the project. And I think you'll hear similar commentary from AGDC and Glenfarne as well. This version of the bill does add some additional details and complexity to what was in the original bill as introduced by the governor. Some additional provisions around the Fairbanks spur line and additional criteria for being eligible to the bill, as well as some additional steps to the calculations. And so with that, I can move on to the appendix, which starts on slide 39. So we were asked to provide a little bit of more information about how the alternative volumetric tax calculation works in the bill before the committee. It's got some nuance to it. And we were asked to do a comparison to Senate Bill 2001, which was the special session bill that the committee has been hearing up until this point. So both of those bills use the same definition for throughput, which is the gas leaving the pipeline, the molecules of gas leaving the pipeline portion of the project, as we discussed earlier in the presentation. And that throughput definition is regardless of which component and regardless of whether the gas is for in-state use or export gas. And again, a different definition than several of the regular session bill versions and concepts that were floating around. So fuel gas used in the treatment plant and pipeline are exempt from the alternative volumetric tax, but fuel gas used in the LNG export facility would be taxable, because that fuel would be used after the gas leaves the pipeline component. And gas delivered to both in-state and export customers would be subject to the AVT. So slide 40,
what a
there's
busy
a lot going
slide
on here, but it's a bit of a nuanced calculation. So we've laid out kind of an order of operations, if you would, of how the alternative volumetric tax would be calculated under the bill before the committee. We were asked for this analysis by the committee to use a capital cost assumption of $54.5 billion in real 2026 terms. That's a little, just shy of a 20% increase on our baseline capital cost assumption, and works out to $58.6 billion in nominal terms. And so the first thing we would do here is we would calculate the component weights. And so we would look at how much capital expenditures were spent on each component, the treatment plant, the pipeline plant, or the pipeline, the LNG plant, and what share of total project capital expenditures do each of those components represent, and we would come up with a component weight. And we could see that the gas treatment plant is about 24% of total project capital cost, pipeline is about 34%, and LNG plant is about 43%. Those component weights would get multiplied times the headline tax rate for each component. And again, there's different headline tax rates for each of the three components, which would arrive at an effective component tax rate. So the effective tax rate on the gas treatment plant would be 3.1 cents per thousand cubic feet, not the 13 cents headline rate. The effective tax rate on the pipeline would be 2 cents per thousand cubic feet, and the effective tax rate on the LNG plant would be 5.5 cents per thousand cubic feet. We would add those up to get an effective project-wide tax rate of about 10.6 cents per 1,000 cubic feet. That would be the amount that would be multiplied times the throughput of the project. Here in fiscal year 2031, we have a total project throughput estimate of 181 billion cubic feet of gas to derive a component revenue and then a project-wide revenue. And so at the end of the day, about $19.3 billion of alternative volumetric tax would be due in fiscal year 2031 in this example. And that would break out to $5.6 million attributable to the treatment plant, $3.7 million attributable to the pipeline, and $10 million attributable to the LNG plant. Slide 41 is the similar analysis looking at Senate Bill 2001 as introduced. The key difference here is that Senate Bill 2001 had a headline tax rate of 12 cents per 1,000 cubic feet for the treatment plant and the LNG plant, whereas 381 has a 13-cent headline rate for those two components. And that is really the only difference between slides 40 and 41. But going from that 12 to 13-cent headline rate for the GTP and LNG plant takes the total AVT revenue in 2031 from 18.1 up to 19.3 million. And again, we picked 2031 would be the first year of AVT revenue in our modeling, and we could do a similar calculation for any of the years in the model, but this just walks through one year's example. Once the project is at full throughput in it would be fiscal year 2034, the numbers themselves in terms of revenue would be higher. But this just illustrates the order of operations.
So the House made a decision. They wanted to see 13 cents, not 12 cents. Gets you an extra, was it extra $1 million?
Senator Stedman.
Yeah, and then so we collect 18.1 million and we got an asset worth 58 billion. What's the millage rate equivalent on that?
Sure, Co-Chair Stedman. So we actually walk through on slide 44 and 45. I'm going to walk through some examples of millage rates.
This is an example of what you're dealing with in the legislature. They look at a cost of a project that they can't build, that they could not find anybody to build, that the state could not build itself, that a private developer is saying, we're going to build it and we're going to fund it. And the state looks at it and says, haha, we get our share. Oh, what do you mean you're not going to build the project unless we take a smaller share? What do you mean? No, we need to take our big share. Look at the reaction from Senator Giesel behind Stedman as he's asking the question. This is entitlement. This is entitlement. It's not their project. Like if they were building the project, they'd have something to say about this, but they don't. They can't build the project. Let's see if I can tee it up here.
Numbers themselves in terms of revenue would be higher, but this just illustrates the order of operations.
Senator Stedman.
Yeah, and then so we collect 18.1 million and we got an asset worth 58 billion. What's the millage rate equivalent on that?
Sure.
They just can't help themselves. They're fixated on the scale of the project, and therefore, because there's more money being spent and it's a more costly project, the state therefore must be entitled to more money. But the project, they can't force Glenfarne to go build the project. and they can't find anybody to build the project for them. Glenfarne's the only one that came in and said, hey, we'll build it, but we're going to own 75% of the project. It's our project. It's a private project. It's not a state project. You got 25% ownership and minority ownership, and you can't build it. So we'll build it, and this is what it's going to take to make it economical. You, Alaskans, you get low-cost gas when we're able to export it. You take the price that you're paying now and you cut it in half. Thereabouts. $8 to $10. Cut it in half to $5, somewhere around $5. You're going to benefit that for the rest of your life. And those people there, they're not thinking about that. They're thinking about, boy, this is a $50 or $60 billion project, and all we get's $18 million a year. It's like their mind's exploding. This is such a large project. We're entitled to more than this. How dare that private company come in and tell us what we can't charge? Do it yourself then. Find somebody that's going to pay what you think you're owed and build the pipeline. Find that. You spent a decade trying to find that. 3 major players in the state of Alaska, ConocoPhillips, Exxon, and BP, all said, we're out. We're not going to do this. We're not going to build this pipeline. That entitlement that you think you have, you only get to exercise that. You only get to be entitled if you've got an alternative to Glenfarne. The correct way to be looking at this is we're basically begging Glenfarne at this point to come in and build the pipeline for us. We spent $1 billion on permitting thus far to get the project where it's at now. We taxpayers, we Alaskans, the government spent $1 billion to get the pipeline where it's at now. So that we can have gas. Not so we can have revenue, so that we can have gas. So that we can heat our homes and lower the cost of business, cost of doing business for our businesses. We don't have an alternative. Glenfarne is it. You want to roll the dice? You say, this structure doesn't work for us. This is an expensive project and we need more. And Glenfarne says, okay, well, we can't build the project. And now you're back to square one. You've got a permitted project and nobody to build it. That's what these people are rolling the dice on. They don't have a way to build the project. They don't know anything about the economics of the project. All they can see is that it's such an expensive project and we're entitled to more tax. That's all they can see. Don't change. We're entitled. We're entitled to more.
Co-Chair Stedman, so we actually walk through on slide 44 and 45. I'm going to walk through some examples of millage rates.
Okay, I'll wait.
So we'll get to that.
Please continue.
All right, moving on to slide 42. So slide 42 shows how the revenue is allocated. So this revenue calculation is done in 2 steps. So the first step is the calculation that we just walked through, where we figure out how much AVT revenue is there. And then completely separately, we take that number and determine how we break that out between the state and municipalities. And so slide 42 shows this allocation under the bill before the committee. It works out in total to about 9% to the state, 91% to the municipalities. In the top here, we've shown an illustration of the capital expenditures.
Yeah, Dean, that's an interesting statement. Too bad we can't get BP in here and say the reason why they left is the legislature. It's undoubtedly likely that's one reason. But another reason is I think BP, being the larger company, needs a larger profit. Like their profit margin needs to be greater than what Glenfarne's is. So Glenfarne can come in and make the 10% return on their investment, right? They're okay with that. BP wasn't okay with it. They needed a higher return on investment. So right up front, they're looking at it and they're like, yeah, we're not going to make enough money on this. So it's not worth the risk that we're going to take. And we have to deal with the legislature. So there's that.
By municipality and by year. The timing and location of those capital expenditures are key to determining the municipal revenue allocations. So under 381, we first, as we did in the previous analysis, we figure out based on the share of capital expenditures to each component, what was the total AVT allocated to that component. And then here on slide 42, for the gas treatment plant and the LNG plant, for the 93% of that component allocated AVT revenue goes to the municipality, which would be North Slope Borough and Kenai Peninsula Borough, with the remaining 7% of the component allocated AVT revenue going to the state. For the pipeline allocated AVT revenue, that revenue has a 50-50 split. For the first 50%, it is distributed between municipalities based on mileage of the pipeline in those municipalities, with the state retaining the unorganized borough component. For the second 50% of that pipeline allocated AVT revenue, that is distributed statewide to all communities in the state on a per capita basis. And so the bottom table here shows the revenue summary by year under our baseline assumptions for the bill before the committee. After going through all of these calculations, and you'll see we break out the 5 key boroughs that the project runs through, and then we have another line here for other communities. And what we've done here is for that second 50% of the pipeline AVT that's spread statewide, for the portion of the per capita sharing within the 5 boroughs, North Slope, Fairbanks, Denali, Mat-Su, Kenai, we've included their share of that per capita distribution in their municipality-specific numbers. And the other communities represents the per capita distribution to all other communities in the state.
So this AVT tax sharing really solidifies support from local municipalities, because when we get down to it and people who are looking at this in a different light than what the Senate Resources or Senate Finance Committee is looking at, or the senators are looking at it, they're looking at it and they're saying, wow, this pipeline could get built. And here are the dollars that we could see coming into the state if you pass the bill. If you don't pass the bill, this money's, coming into our municipalities. This is the money that could be coming to the municipality, to the borough, if you pass the bill. If you don't pass the bill, then the pipeline won't get built, and we won't see this money coming into the borough. So they're looking at it more realistic than the state is. Now you've got support, broad support from your people, from your local government and local jurisdictions to help push this along, right? It isn't just reliant upon the Senate, even though they're the decision makers. The influencers are down at the local level who are looking at it and saying, wow, you know what? Those dollar figures actually matter to our jurisdiction. We don't just see a bump in our revenue like this. This is a game changer for us. This is a lot of extra money for us. juxtapose that with the senators, like Matt Clayman, who thinks he wants to be Governor Clayman, who says, we're only going to get, and then put a dollar figure to it. We're only going to get $1 billion. We're only going to get $800 million. Your local guys are looking at it and saying, wow, this is going to benefit us greatly. And the senators are looking at it and they're not saying that same thing. This is the problem with the legislature. It's disconnected. It's disconnected from what really matters. These senators are disconnected from what really matters. They think they and their decisions and the legislature and this process that they're going through, they think that's the center of the universe. The center of the universe is actually a little bit more distributed. It is in each one of our communities. It's represented by our local governments and our local boroughs that are on this sheet here. Now, obviously, there are other, it's distributed a little bit further than that aren't represented on this sheet. Namely, Western Alaska and the population that exists that's outside of these boroughs. This is where the gravity is, the center of gravity. This is where the population and where the benefit of the pipeline actually matters. It's not in Senate resources. That's not where the pipeline matters. And those senators are completely out of touch with that fact. This whole questioning that we've got today, this trying to compare to it's obtuse. It's comparing it to the current statute that is never going to build a pipeline it's pointless. Anyway, interesting. Let's jump to AGDC and Glenfarne, their take on this in the interest of time here. That should be right about here. Somewhere here. There we go.
Record and begin with your presentation.
Co-Chair Hoffman, Co-Chair Stedman, Co-Chair Olson, and members of the committee, thanks for having me back here. Excited to walk you through what came out of the House last week. I understand we have about 25 minutes today, so we'll have to obviously carry on further tomorrow.
Yes, don't rush yourself. Just
Yep, we'll not.
Normal. We'll pick up what we don't cover tomorrow.
We got time to kill.
I'm the
Wait, Senator Stedman. Yeah.
We got to get to the end of the week.
I think it'd be beneficial to have him lay out his working relationship with Alaska Gasline Development Agency, who he works for, and so there's clarity. There's no confusion.
Sure.
Yep.
Mr. Kissinger.
So again, Matt Kissinger, I'm the commercial director for AGDC. I am what's called agency staff or contract staff. So actually, I come into AGDC through a company called Hawk Consultants out of Anchorage. Sort of, that's just where the paycheck comes from, but I, for all intents and purposes, work directly for AGDC. I also am seconded into the 8-star structure for the purposes of LNG and gas sales. So I do a lot of the negotiations with the Asian counterparties and with the local gas supply customers as well.
Thank you. Please proceed.
I'd also like to just start with a quick mea culpa. I was here before this committee about a week and a half ago, and I made the comment that North Star had its AOGCC offtake authorization. And since then, I think we've all become aware that that's not the case. So I was misinformed, and I apologize for putting that on the record. All right. So just to kick off the sectional analysis, I'd like to say that there was a lot of really good bipartisan discussion done within the Finance Committee of the House over the last 2 weeks. I think that was evidenced by this bill getting a unanimous approval through that committee, and then having a limited number of amendments on the floor. In fact, I think just one amendment that was passed. There is a lot of balance structured into this, balance between the lower AVT, impact payments, some of the transparency initiatives for AGDC, and all of this really, we hope, starts to hang together in something that is beneficial to all the parties involved, including the legislature, in getting the right amount of information. So with that, I will move forward. These are the sections of HB 381, and with your indulgence, Chair Hoffman, instead of going through this in order of the sections, what I have done, and you can see this on slide 3, is I've grouped this into functionally what the sections do. And so there's a section on tax and municipal impact provisions that I'll touch on first. There's a section on the utility buyer protections that I think is very interesting. I'll hit on second. Then we'll go through the AGDC provisions, of which there are a lot of them. And then we'll talk about the sunset, the rationale for that sunset. And then finally, there are technical pieces that really just change the language within statute, but I can lay those out as well. So moving on, before I start with the tax provisions, Chair Hoffman, with your indulgence, I'd like to invite the president of 8-Star Alaska and Glenfarne and Alaska LNG, Adam Prestige, up to the table to sort of walk through some of the rationale behind the tax provisions with me.
Please come forward, Mr. Prestige.
Adam Prestige, President of Glenfarne, Alaska LNG.
All right. Within the tax provisions, there are 4 sections that really address it. Section 25 in the bill is really where most of the meat is. This is the section that does a couple of things. The first thing it does is it sets a tax abatement period. And by tax abatement, meaning there is no property tax paid during this period. It is until volumes hit 500 million cubic feet per day, or 5 years from commercial operations, whichever is first. And just for reference, right now, we consume about 200 million standard cubic feet a day in utility demand along the rail belt. The second part of it is after that abatement period, an alternative volumetric tax is established. Mr. Stickle with the Department of Revenue just went through that, but we will touch up further on it. And then finally, there's what is the eligibility criteria. And the Fairbanks spur line plays a major role in that eligibility criteria, but there's more to it than that. But I will go through more detail around that Fairbanks spur. And then it establishes a collection and allocation methodology that Mr. Stickle just really spoke through, so I won't go into too much detail around that. And it sets out appeals and distraint in case of non-payment, which is standard for any property tax as far as I am understood. It creates termination timelines, which are, we have to commence construction by 2032 and need to commence commercial operations of at least one major sub-project by 2037, or they expire. And then there are reporting requirements, and then of course the definitions of that section. Section 28, I'll also give more detail on, and that addresses municipal impact grants. So this is something missing out of the current tax structure. Under the current tax structure, as long as AGDC is a partner to the project, then there is no property tax paid during construction. That does leave the communities holding the bag somewhat. As you know, there will be impacts during construction. These will be actual costs to the municipalities, and we believe that they should be offset. In the conversations with House Finance, we discussed a sort of 2-tiered process that I'll go through with respect to that. And then finally, Section 31 is conditions to be met. That's the further to the spur line. Walk through that. And then 33 is more of a technical section that just enforces the abatement or puts the abatement and the AVT effective dates into statute. Any questions on that?
Proceed.
All right. So to start first with the alternative volumetric tax, again, Mr. Stickle just went through this, but I'm going to invite Mr. Prestige to walk through this one more time from the developer's point of view.
This is Adam Prestige from Glenfarne, Alaska. What I will comment, not to reiterate too much of what the Department of Revenue, Dan Stickle, went through. What I want to comment on, I guess, is again, a structure that's meant to be predictable and consistent for all parties involved. And so one of the benefits, one of several benefits that we see with the alternative volumetric tax is that it is calculated based on a reportable throughput on the pipeline that is then calculated by multipliers, and there's no question of valuation applied to that. And so what that means is that we avoid, for all parties involved, the potential for a litigation over what is the value of this property over the decades to come. And the result of that litigation could be a higher valuation, could be a lower valuation. At the end of the day, what it means is that nobody in this room, no investor, no state treasurer is able to truly predict what would be the revenue from a property tax that was based purely on valuation. The alternative volumetric tax is something that can be calculated on a very straightforward mathematical basis. The other thing that I want to highlight is that this tax structure with the alternative volumetric tax has the benefit of creating alignment. And so the more gas that flows on the pipeline, the greater the revenue to the state. The more gas that flows on the pipeline, the lower the cost of gas to the ratepayers. And structuring this way incentivizes essentially a greater use of the facility, of the pipeline itself. The last point that I'll make, in a bit of a response to one of the points that was raised in the Department of Revenue's presentation, the financial structure of House Bill 381 is very carefully constructed. It's a somewhat complicated piece of legislation with numerous different economic points. One of those key economic points that we'll talk about shortly in this presentation is that Glenfarne has made the commitment to cap the price of gas at $16, which inflates over time as is customary. But that price cap, that commitment that we can get this project done with a cap on the price at $16 is an extraordinary commitment. It is a commitment that we're able to make on the basis of how 381 was put together. If there were a significant change to the tax structure, for example, going from 2 mils to 3 mils would be a 50% increase on the tax burden as set out in HB 381. That would really challenge our ability to maintain that $16 price cap. As I said, the bill is carefully constructed to have all the pieces work together. If you change one of the pieces in a major way, it's going to require us to try to make all the other make the other pieces accommodate that change. So those are a couple thoughts on the structure and the benefit of the alternative volumetric tax.
But the legislature's not going to like hearing something where they lose control over the ability to sue over values, right? And they it simplifies things. It makes it more predictable, and they get less revenue than what they think that they're entitled to. You got to have it all as one package, because if you tweak one area, now we'll have to adjust other areas to make it work. I mean, it's kind of like a fiscal plan for a pipeline. Legislature is going to have a hard time, the senators especially, going to have a hard time wrapping their head around something that makes sense. Anyway, I'm going to make an executive decision here in the interest of time, and I know that we've got a few more minutes left in the show, the time available here, but they're going to finish this briefing tomorrow, so we're going to catch up on this plus what they talk about tomorrow, all in one segment. I just realized that that's going to seem discombobulated if you're trying to catch the whole thing on one evening you're only going to see it on 2 different evenings. So we're going to catch this and the rest of their meeting tomorrow, all in tomorrow's show. That'll make it easy for us to keep up with it. All right. Senate has got its work cut out for it. There is a lot of envy and a lot of greed that is gripped the hearts of the people in that building, and it is going to be a challenge for them to get over this. So you need to call your senator and let them know what you feel. Get the pipeline built. Get this bill passed and get a pipeline built so that we all can have lower cost energy eventually. All right. Thanks all for joining tonight. It's great to be back. Great to be with you. Appreciate you sticking with it for this 2 hours, and we'll see you tomorrow night. Have a good night.